So far in this series, we've looked at Jesus' life and his death and resurrection and ascension. 10 days after his ascension, on the day of Pentecost, God sent his Holy Spirit on Jesus' followers. And ever since the day of Pentecost, Jesus has been transforming the lives of millions of people across the world. But why exactly was it that the Son of God became a human being and died and rose again and ascended into heaven? And how exactly is Jesus able to transform people? To answer these questions, we need to start at the very beginning of the Bible story. At the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis chapters 1 and 2, we read how God created the universe, the sun and moon and stars, and this planet Earth. He filled Earth with all kinds of living things. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, over the livestock, and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." And so God created the first humans, Adam and Eve. God created humans in his image and likeness. But what does it mean to be in God's image and likeness? We humans aren't actually divine, of course, but nonetheless we are like God. In various ways we reflect his nature and his character. Why did God create us? God wanted our human race to make this whole planet a paradise. And he created us to be his friends, working with him to carry out this wonderful task. God wanted Earth to be the place where he lived among us, God's people living in God's presence, in God's paradise. As we said at the beginning of these talks, after God had created this world, he said it was very good. But the world we live in now is spoiled. So what went wrong? The first humans, Adam and Eve, lived in the Garden of Eden. A river ran through the garden to water it. In the garden were beautiful trees that yielded delicious fruit. It really was a most wonderful place to live. It seems that God himself came regularly and met with Adam and Eve there. But one day a snake got into the garden. This was no ordinary snake. Earlier in our series we learnt about a powerful angel called Satan. He is God's chief enemy. This snake may have been Satan's messenger, or it may have been Satan himself in disguise. God had told Adam, "You are free to eat from any tree in the garden, But you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." Why did God forbid Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Why would they die if they ate the fruit of this tree? And why did God plant the tree there in the first place? But Adam and Eve didn't need to know any of this. All they had to do was to trust God and obey Him. That was the whole point. God wanted them to learn to trust Him and obey Him. He wanted them to learn that He is good. He wanted them to discover that He could always be trusted, that He always had their best interests at heart. He wanted them to learn how much He loved them. By planting this tree in the garden, God was giving Adam and Eve a choice. Would they trust and obey Him, or would they rebel against Him and decide for themselves how to live? The snake focused Eve's mind on this tree, the tree of a knowledge of good and evil. He began to cast doubt on God's character. Was God being completely truthful? Was there something He wasn't telling her, something she had a right to know? Was God keeping something back from her? Then the snake came straight out with it. He said to Eve, "You will not certainly die, for God knows that when you eat from it your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." In other words, the snake was saying this: God is lying. You won't really die if you eat this fruit. Go and eat from that tree. Choose for yourself what's good for you and what's bad for you. Choose for yourself how to live. Only then will you be truly free. Only then will you have a life that's really worth living. Eve took some of the fruit and she ate it. She also gave some to Adam, and he ate it. This painting captures the moment when Eve handed a fruit to Adam. The snake had made Adam and Eve think wrongly about God. It made them think that God wasn't trustworthy, that He didn't love them, that He was selfish, and that He didn't have their best interests at heart. That's what Satan wants us to believe about God too. And the snake had made Adam and Eve think wrongly about themselves. Now they believed that they could do without God and decide for themselves how to live. That's what Satan wants us to think too. By eating the forbidden fruit, Adam and Eve were saying this: we know better than God. From now on, we'll decide for ourselves how to live. This was an act of rebellion against God. In other words, it was a sin. This was the moment when things went wrong with this world. Adam and Eve had deliberately defied and disrespected the holy God, their Creator and Lord, and their sin had catastrophic impact on them and on this world. God couldn't simply forgive Adam and Eve and carry on as if nothing had happened. God had to deal with their sin. Here's an illustration that helps us to understand why. Imagine that you've just had a beautiful new carpet laid in your lounge. Then your puppy does what puppies do and deposits a smelly pile on your new carpet. There's no way you can just leave this. You have to deal with it. You have to remove the mess, clean the carpet and freshen the air in the room. That's what sin is like. Adam and Eve's sin polluted God's world, and it polluted them too. God cares deeply for mankind and for the world He created. He couldn't just sit back and do nothing. He needed to deal with sin and all its consequences. Here's another illustration. All of us have a sense of justice. Criminals must pay for their crimes. Thieves should return the things they have stolen. Vandals should pay for the damage they've done. Abusers should suffer the punishment appropriate to their crimes. Adam and Eve's act of rebellion spoiled God's beautiful world. Justice demanded that they face the consequences. And so God passed judgment. He cursed the snake. Satan was doomed. Nothing he did would ever, in the end, succeed. Then God passed judgment on Adam and Eve. From now on, their lives would be difficult, and their lives would end in physical death. So what were all the effects of Adam and Eve's first sin? Firstly, their character had changed. They hadn't only rebelled against God, they had become rebels. In other words, they had become sinners. From now on, it was natural for them to disobey God, to do what they wanted and not what God wanted. And all their descendants would have that same rebellious character too. It was inevitable. That's because we're all connected to Adam. God created only one human directly. That was Adam. God made Eve from Adam's body, and all of us are descended from this human pair. So we humans are all connected. We're all connected back to our ancestor Adam. And so Adam's sin has affected all of us. We can illustrate this by an event that happened many years ago. On the 3rd of September 1939, the United Kingdom declared war on Germany. Every citizen of the United Kingdom was included in that declaration, whether they liked it or not. From that day on, all British citizens were involved in that war. In effect, Adam declared war against God, and so we all began life in a state of war against God. We all have a self-willed character. We all want our own way. That becomes obvious in our very first years. We all want to live as if we, and not God, are masters of our lives. That was one effect of Adam's first sin. Another effect was this. All of us began life in a state of being spiritually dead. God had told Adam, "You must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die." But Adam continued to live for many years. In fact, he died at the ripe old age of 930 years. So what did God mean? What actually happens when someone dies? Their earthly body decays, but they themselves continue to exist. They enter a new, unseen dimension. They have no further contact with this world, and all the relationships they had in this world are broken. And that's what death really is. Death is broken relationship. At the moment they committed that first sin, Adam and Eve's relationship with God was broken. They were no longer God's friends. They were alienated from him. They died spiritually. And one day, of course, they would also die physically. As we've just said, we're all connected to our ancestor Adam, and so we too began life alienated from God. In other words, we began life spiritually dead. That alienation from God brings an emptiness that no one and nothing else can fill. We suffer guilt, anxiety, frustration, and loneliness. People search vainly for meaning in life. And we too, like Adam, are doomed to die physically. After Adam had sinned, God also said to him, "You are dust, and to dust you shall return." Eventually, Adam died physically. All of us, too, unless Jesus returns before then, will die physically. That doesn't mean that we'll cease to exist. We'll continue to exist for all eternity. But what that existence will be like depends on how we respond to the good news about Jesus Christ and his salvation. So, because of sin, we suffer two deaths, spiritual death and physical death. That's an important thing to understand. It's something we'll pick up again in our final talk. What else has sin done to us? Sin impacts our relationships with other people. They're spoiled by selfishness, anger, jealousy, conflict, and unforgiveness. Sin, too, makes our lives difficult. When God passed judgment on Adam and Eve, he said that both the woman's special role as child-bearer and the man's special role as provider for his family would be accompanied by pain. Every human's life would now be difficult. It was difficult for Adam and Eve. It is difficult for us too. This natural world also suffers because of human sin. Diseases and death and so-called natural disasters spoil our world. Sin also makes us debtors. What do we mean by that? We've all, whether intentionally or not, spoiled other people's lives through our sin or our mistakes. Again and again we find that we can't put things right even when we want to. So we owe other people a debt that so often we can never repay. And other people's sin and mistakes spoil our own lives too, so often with consequences that they can't put right. And so other people owe us a debt too. And our sin also makes us debtors to God. God intended this planet Earth to be a paradise where people lived in harmony with God and with each other. But human sin devastates God's world. We all owe God a debt we cannot possibly repay. So our sin makes us debtors to God and to other people. By any standard of justice, we know that our debt needs to be repaid. There's something else that sin has done. When Adam and Eve sinned, they obeyed Satan rather than God. So Satan gained power over our human race. John, one of the disciples of Jesus, said that the whole world is under the control of the evil one. We can see that so clearly when we look back over human history. This image from the First World War shows soldiers trudging through a landscape that's been devastated by artillery fire. However, we need to remember that Satan rules human society only by God's permission and within God's limits. So Adam and Eve's first sin devastated our human race and the natural world in all these different ways. However could God sort all this out and put everything right? The rest of the Bible tells us how he did this. In fact, God begins to show us what he will do right at the very beginning. After God had cursed the snake, he said to it, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." From that moment there would be a battle between Satan and Eve, and between people who follow Satan and people who follow God. But one day a single descendant of Eve would crush Satan and defeat him. That descendant is Jesus Christ. He has defeated Satan. We'll see how in our next talk.